Committee will come to order. Today we meet to report H.R. 5872, the Sequestration Transparency Act of 2012. I will make an opening statement limited to 5 minutes, as well as the ranking minority member from Maryland. Pursuant to the agreement with the ranking member, an amendment offered by Mr. Van Hollen will be debatable for 80 minutes evenly divided. Given the time constraints, I ask that members insert their written statements into the record. I will hold the record open until the end of the day for that purpose. To ensure that we have flexibility to accommodate the schedule, I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time. Without objection, so ordered. I will now take 5 minutes, hit the clock for an opening statement. Welcome everybody to the Budget Committee. Today we meet to mark up the Sequestration Transparency Act of 2012. It's a bill to require the Office of Management and Budget to provide information on how it will implement the across-the-board cuts that are scheduled to take place effect on January 2nd, 2013. Under the Budget Control Act, the Office of Management and Budget will make arbitrary across-the-board spending cuts, resulting in a 10% cut to defense spending and an 8% cut to non-defense discretionary spending. There is strong bipartisan agreement that the sequester is bad policy and should be reprioritized. That's exactly why House Republicans passed legislation last month that would replace these crippling cuts with common sense reforms and spending reductions. Unfortunately, we have not seen action from the Senate, and the White House has not put forward a specific proposal. As each day goes by, we get closer and closer to these cuts being implemented. This committee held hearings earlier this year in the Budget Control Act sequester process, and I followed up with a letter to OMB requesting details on how this sequester could be implemented. Despite repeated inquiries, OMB has not provided the requested information, and we still do not know how specific federal programs and activities will be affected. To address these concerns, the bill that we are marking up today would simply require the President to submit a report to Congress that includes the basic details of the looming sequester and the actions to be taken under it. This is a concern for both parties and for all Americans. The bill simply aims to provide transparency to the Congress and to the American public. While we want to replace these savings with common sense reforms, the House has passed legislation to do so. We cannot turn a blind eye to these across-the-board reductions and how that they will be implemented. We had a hearing here with the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Panetta. We had the Joint Chiefs Chairman, Mr. Dempsey, General Dempsey, talking about the devastating effects of the sequester. That's why we've acted. The Senate has passed on a bipartisan basis, go figure, a voice vote. They've passed legislation requiring disclosure of additional information on the sequester, and I hope that we can report this legislation today because it has already received bipartisan support. I want to thank Jeb Hensling, Congressman from Texas, who served as the Republican co-chair of the Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction, for introducing this important bill. And before calling up the legislation, I want to yield to Mr. Van Hollen for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the Chairman indicated, I think there's general bipartisan agreement that the across-the-board meat tax cuts that are set to begin in January would be bad for the country. Not only would the overall size and immediacy of the cuts put a drag on an already fragile economy, but the arbitrary buzzsaw nature of the cuts would wreak havoc on defense and non-defense programs alike. As Secretary Panetta made clear, both the magnitude and the arbitrary nature of the cuts will damage our national defense. What has received far less attention is the devastating impact the cuts will have on other vital services and investments, cutting our air traffic controllers and putting air safety at risk, putting the public safety at risk by cutting the FBI, cutting the COPS program, and cutting border security, putting food safety at risk, cutting our investment in early education in K through 12 and special education for kids with disabilities, and cuts in vital investments for our economy in transportation, in science and research. In fact, a coalition of universities and groups, including the American Cancer Society, the Biotechnology Industry Association, pharma, and others, have concluded that the cuts to the National Institutes of Health will jeopardize America's competitive edge in medical research and result in the loss of more than 33,000 jobs in the biotech sector. Scientific research into treatments and cures to cancer, to diabetes, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and other diseases that plague American families will be put on the chopping block along with our competitive edge in this important area of research. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm all for getting more detailed information about the negative impacts of the Meat Act's cuts, but I think our focus should be on avoiding what you just said, and we all agree, is an irresponsible approach to the budget and would be an irresponsible approach to cutting the budget. And that means coming up with an alternative approach to reducing the deficit in a credible and stable way. Every bipartisan group that's examined this challenge has concluded that we need to take a balanced approach to deficit reduction, meaning combining cuts with revenues generated by cutting a lot of the unnecessary tax breaks and special interest loopholes. Now, the Budget Control Act, which was passed last summer, already cuts the budget by almost $1 trillion over 10 years, 100% cuts. Putting aside the fact that the House Republican budget violates that agreement by cutting another $19 billion, the appropriators are hard at work trying to find a way to make those cuts in a targeted fashion. If we want to do our job and replace the sequester and find another way to reduce the deficit, we should come together in the balanced way that bipartisan groups have recommended. And that means, as I said, not just cuts to programs, but also cutting loopholes. Now, I agree with what the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Buck McKeon, said just the other day. Why don't we do something to fix it now? We should. And in fact, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee last October, when asked about using some revenue to prevent defense cuts, said, and I quote, "If it came that I had only two choices, one was a tax increase and one was a cut in defense over and above where we already are, I would go to strengthen defense," unquote. Senator McCain just the other day made the point that when you eliminate a special interest tax break like ethanol subsidies, there's no rational reason why you shouldn't be able to apply that savings to deficit reduction, including deficit reduction that will prevent the sequester from taking place. So it was unfortunately counterproductive to have Grover Norquist back on the Hill this week in front of the Ways and Means Committee, again enforcing a rule that prevents us Republicans who signed the pledge from closing one special interest tax loophole for the purpose of preventing defense cuts. So at the end of the day, that was the choice that was made. I hope people will make the choice that Chairman McKeon laid out earlier, which is a willingness to shut down special interest loopholes in order to prevent deep across-the-board cuts to both defense and non-defense programs and reduce the deficit in a more rational way. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The committee will now proceed to consideration of the Sequestration and Transparency Act of 2012. I ask unanimous consent that the first reading of the bill be dispensed with and that the bill be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. To begin with, I have an amendment in the nature of the substitute, which will be made in order as original text. The clerk will designate the amendment. A copy of the amendment has already been distributed.
Mr. Chairman, an amendment offered in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5872, offered by Mr. Ryan of Wisconsin.
The manager's amendment changes the reporting date in the bill from July 9th, 2012 to 30 days after enactment and makes other technical and conforming changes to the bill text. The question is on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of the substitute offered by the chairman as an amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. There are other amendments to H.R. 5872.
Chairman, I believe I have an amendment at the desk.
Sir Van Hollen has an amendment. The clerk will designate the amendment and the staff will distribute copies.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Van Hollen, the balanced approach to deficit reduction.
Under a previous arrangement, we will debate the amendment for 80 minutes, evenly divided. As is customary, we'll go with 35 minutes for the proponent, 40 minutes for the opponents, and then 5 minutes to close for the proponent, Mr. Van Hollen. So the gentleman from Maryland is now recognized for 35 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As I said, I agree with the chairman of the Armed Services Committee who said we should focus on replacing the sequester now, and that's what this amendment does. If the committee were to adopt this amendment, we would be calling for two things. One is to replace the sequester and reduce the deficit in a balanced way over 10 years, but specifically pass provisions that would prevent the first year of the sequester, both to defense and non-defense spending. And it does it through a mix of cuts and revenue. The cuts are to the direct payments, the farm subsidies, where there's general bipartisan agreement that those payments are a waste of taxpayer dollars. It includes some cuts from a number of other areas within that budget, and then it also calls for the elimination of taxpayer subsidies to the big oil companies, the majors. It also would invoke the Buffett rule, which stands for a very simple proposition, which is that people who are working for people who are making millions and millions of dollars a year should not pay a higher effective tax rate than their bosses, something that President Reagan talked about. So those three elements, a combination of cuts and revenue, would replace the sequester during the first year and therefore avoid the cuts both to defense and non-defense that we believe would both hurt the very fragile recovery, but also wreak havoc in terms of the across-the-board buzzsaw way in which they would be implemented. So with that, I reserve the balance of our time.
Well, you're going to continue to somebody else.
I don't know if you want to...
Oh, you want to... No, it's 35 minutes and then 40.
You want to do it that way?
5. Yeah, I think that's what we had agreed to. Doesn't really matter to me, but...
I'd be happy to yield on your time. You got lots of time.
You did look like you were using yours, I thought.
Well, no, we will. I thought we were going to go back and forth. I don't...
I don't mind doing that.
We're happy to do the set-piece approach if you want.
Members want to do that? You see that we...
I yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. I ask consent that the time be distributed, controlled by the chairman and the ranking member. So it's just 40-40.
Yeah.
Okay. You 3 minutes to the gentlelady from...
Sure, I didn't know if you wanted to go Republican. That's fine. All right, we'll keep going here. A little confusion on process, but I'm...
Sorry.
You know, we are here again this morning as we have a conversation about, at least in part, about deficit reduction, and certainly specifically the consequences of implementation of sequestration should Congress fail to reach agreement on an alternative and the means of achieving deficit reduction of $100 billion next year and $1.2 trillion over 10. I think that many of us on this side of the aisle, and I think actually most of us Republicans and Democrats believe that it is preferable to avoid across the board cuts to defense and non-defense spending and find a way to achieve the deficit reduction in a way that is more in our control and more, I would hope, balanced, which is what I'm going to talk about. There's no question that I would also agree that information on what the cuts would mean under sequester would mean to defense and non-defense spending, and sharing that with the American people is certainly a good idea and advisable. I will support this legislation this morning. But understand that the more important action, or at least action we should be taking as well as obtaining this information, is that we should be working to find that common ground and to find the long-term solutions to deficit reduction. This is a piece of information. It's useful. But again, if we all believe that sequester is not the preferable route to take, then we should be working on what is truly a bipartisan solution. And as I think the other side of the aisle knows at this point, and certainly we should make explicit yet again, that the only way we get there is with a balanced approach to deficit reduction that provides certainty and fairness in our policies, but specifically reduces government spending by identifying and funding our priorities, while also eliminating inefficiencies in government spending and reducing some of that government spending. But second, we have got to, and every bipartisan group out there has said this is what we have to do, is that we also have to generate revenue to reduce the deficit. It is simply not possible to meet our obligations, even in the most minimal way, without some revenue to reduce the deficit. That's got to be on the table. And we've got to use those dollars to meet our obligations to our people and to our future. And we should certainly start by also getting rid of unnecessary and wasteful tax expenditures. We see that as a cost and in our budget, and we need to put those tax expenditures on the table. And the inability for us to deal with revenues, to get any support from the Republicans on revenue side, is obviously making it very difficult to come to a bipartisan balanced solution. I also have to say that we should be making targeted investments to grow our economy, both in the short term and in the long term, to create that environment for private sector job creation. What we should not do, and again, all the experts say this, is to put our economic recovery in this year or next year at risk, and that we should look towards the kind of investments we have to make to grow our economy for the long term. And what we also believe is that we should not allow these arbitrary cuts to put our seniors or our children or our middle class at risk. So sequester isn't, it was put in place to in fact force us to work together and find bipartisan agreement to achieve deficit reduction. So again, while it's useful to know what would happen if we didn't do that, we really ought to be working on that bipartisan solution. But instead of working on the balanced solution, Republicans in Congress have walked away from a balanced approach time and time again. And I believe that is hurting our economy. It's hurting the certainty that our business community is asking for, and it certainly is putting at risk growth of the middle class and attention to meeting our obligations to our seniors and, of course, to folks who really rely on a lot of government efforts in terms of education and health care in particular. So the Republican rejection of a balanced approach that includes cuts, revenue, and economic growth is really hurting us and in this country. So we're marking up a bill today that does require our OMB to report on how sequester would affect specific line items in the budget. I think the understanding the potential impact of sequester and the concerns that so many of us have about what it should mean and making that public to the American people is important. But let me also say that this report is, while it might be helpful, falls short of providing complete information because it fails to give us a full picture of the consequences of the federal budget options that the Republicans have voted for in their budget proposal. So the American people deserve to know the impact of not only of sequester, but they deserve to know the impact of the Republican budget that seeks to cut only spending in non-defense discretionary, not in defense funding at all. And I would like to see that included in what we do, and I'm sorry that it doesn't. So let me just close by saying that it would be far preferable for us to be getting where we need to get to, which is really agreement on how we deal with what is very serious, which is our fiscal policies in this country, and being able to bring down our deficit over the long term while growing the economy, ensuring that this country continues to offer opportunity and prosperity, not only for the wealthiest businesses in this country and the wealthiest Americans in this country, but for middle-class Americans, and in fact for all of us. And the choices the Republicans have made in their budget suggest that they are not going to do and would not do the kind of investments nor are they going to do the kind of calling on our wealthiest corporations and Americans to do their share. So with that, while I support this transparency, it does not address directly the concerns that we all have about reaching a long-term solution to deficit reduction in a bipartisan way. And I yield back.
All right, the chair will yield, control 40 minutes on our side, and I will yield at this time myself such time as I may consume. I want to make 3 points. Number one, the House has already passed legislation in specificity dealing with the sequester. Number two, it violates House rules. Number three, the amendment's just bad policy. Let me explain what I mean when I say all three of those points. Number one, as we all know, we had a markup here where we actually used the reconciliation process for what it was originally designed to, which was to deal with spending to replace the sequester. In fact, under CBO scoring, our bill that we've already passed through the House would have resulted in a net deficit reduction of $242 billion. over 10 years. I take a look at the score of this amendment. It results in an $85 billion tax increase. That's on top of the tax increases that are already coming in January. Never mind the fact that we have this monumental tax hike coming in January, which is putting a chilling effect on economic growth, on uncertainty in the business community. This is $85 billion in tax increases on top of that, then only to be outdone by more spending. Yes, it repeals direct spending, and I'll get to that in a second on agricultural programs, but it results in $55 billion in higher spending. So you have a big tax increase in here with a big spending increase as the substitute for replacing the sequester. Number two, it would violate the House rules. It would violate the House rules in two ways. This would, first of all, have a tax increase in it, which violates the fact that we cannot, it's out of our jurisdiction. You had to originate tax increases from the Ways and Means Committee. Those of us on Ways and Means know how that works. Second, it would violate the House cut-go rule because it would not offset spending increases with spending cuts. This bill that we're marking up here is 3 pages. A bill with even more detail was passed in the Senate, but very similar, on a voice vote. The bill, the amendment in the substitute we're taking here is, 150 or so pages. 1 page in the substitute is in our committee's jurisdiction. Every other page of this amendment in the substitute is outside of our committee's jurisdiction. So we don't even have the jurisdiction to do this. Things like agricultural reform are going to be dealt with in the Farm Bill. Tax policy is dealt with in the Ways and Means Committee. I think members know that we don't have the jurisdiction to do those things. Let me conclude with this. It's bad policy. Here is what we mean. I keep hearing the balanced approach, all the bipartisan groups use tax expenditures. Maybe it's just a difference of opinion on economic philosophy. We believe that trying to close this fiscal gap through higher taxes will do 2 things. Slow down economic growth and prohibit job creation, thereby lowering revenues. And number 2, it will take the pressure off of Congress to cut spending. If we put ourselves on the position of simply chasing higher levels of spending with higher levels of taxation, the two will never catch up. We'll end up shutting down the economy and having a debt crisis even faster. People talk about the balanced approach. If you take a look at the studies that have been done on nations that have been confronting sovereign debt crises, the countries that got their act together, that put their fiscal house in order, that had the most lasting growth-enhancing fiscal consolidations are the countries that attacked spending, that did not tax their way out of these problems. Here's the issue. We are in the global economy today, whether we like it or not. Our tax rates matter. 8 out of 10 businesses in America file their taxes as individuals, as subchapter S corporations, as LLCs, as partnerships. 9 out of 10 in Wisconsin do. Overseas, where I come from means Lake Superior, the Canadians lowered their tax rate on all of their businesses to 15%. This January, the top effective tax rate is going to 44.8%. How on earth are those successful small businesses where 65% of our net new jobs come from, where more than half of Americans work, going to be able to compete if we're going to crank up their taxes to nearly 45% federally when our competitors are lowering their tax rates on their businesses? The average tax rate on businesses in the industrialized world is 25%. England's lowering their tax rate to 22%. As I mentioned, Canada's at 15%. Ireland's at 12.5%. China's at 25%. We want to go to 45% on our successful small businesses? Then look at the corporate sector, the large C Corp corporations. That's the highest rate in the world as well, at 35%. And what are we doing here? We're saying under the balanced approach, we need to raise those tax rates even more. Now, the reason we don't want to use tax expenditures to replace spending cuts is we want to use tax expenditures to lower tax rates. And the reason we want to lower tax rates is to grow the economy, create jobs and prosperity, get American businesses on a competitive level playing field when it comes to how we tax our businesses. For every dollar we take from a tax expenditure to raise revenue, to displace cutting spending, we do 2 bad things. We take the pressure off the need to get spending under control. Government, as the size of government, is already a 5th larger than it has been on average for the last 60 years. We have the largest government as a percentage of GDP since we've had since World War II. That's problem number one. Problem number two is for every dollar we take in tax expenditures, not to lower tax rates, we end up with resulting higher tax rates. And if we end up with much higher tax rates than our foreign competitors are taxing theirs, here's how it works. We tax our businesses at much higher rates than our foreign competitors tax theirs. They win, we lose. It's a global economy whether we like it or not. So we believe the secret to economic success is a combination of getting our spending under control. All we're saying is get the size of our government down to where it has historically been for the last 60 years. It's not a lot. And we're saying let's do comprehensive tax reform. Obviously that's not in this committee, but in the Ways and Means Committee, so that we can have economic growth. If borrowing and spending and taxing more money, which is effectively what this substitute proposes to do, were the secret to economic success, we would be entering a golden age along with Greece. What we have learned are those countries that push aside the tough decisions to do structural entitlement reforms, to get their spending under control, end up putting themselves on an austerity cycle. It's like the hamster on the wheel. You pass a package that has quote-unquote balance, which is a combination of tax increases and minor spending cuts, and the bond markets turn on you a year later. What we are attempting to do with the bill we passed to replace the sequester, with the budget we passed, was to preempt and prevent austerity in the first place. We're going to have one more chance in this country to prevent European-like austerity. We know a debt crisis is coming. That is crystal clear. We know why it's coming. We know approximately when it's coming because we've had all these witnesses come up and tell us about that. What we want to do is have those fundamental structural entitlement reforms, those spending reductions that show our constituents, the world, the credit markets, that we're getting our debt and deficit under control in a real, meaningful, and lasting way, and that we're going to have economic growth and prosperity. And that economic growth and prosperity does not derive from putting more power in Washington, regulating all key sectors of our economy more, micromanaging people's decisions through the spending, regulatory, and tax structure. Growth comes from letting people keep more of their own hard-earned money, letting businesses be competitive with respect to their competitors overseas by having fundamental tax reform. That is one of the balanced things that bipartisan groups agree with. Lower tax rates through a broader tax base is the secret to economic success on the tax reform front. That is what we propose to do. And what we do not want to do is end up with a system or a package where we have higher tax rates, which hurts growth, where we don't do the spending cuts which are necessary to actually get ourselves on the right trajectory to lower our deficit and debt, and then we find ourselves in austerity. Then we find ourselves a year later after we pass a package and the politicians high-five themselves up here, having the bond markets turn on us again, and then we're going to have to do another round, and then another round, and then another round. That's exactly what is happening in Europe, and we do not want to put ourselves on the European austerity track, because if we do that, we know without a shadow of a doubt we will be giving our children and our grandchildren an inferior standard of living. We're going to have one chance to get this right. Hopefully it's with the right kind of leadership in place next year to pass a fundamental budget restructuring that gets our entitlements under control so that we can keep the commitment to our current seniors, reform these programs so that those of us who are younger have something we can count on, and make sure that we never get to those dangerous levels of debt, and reform our tax system by putting our tax expenditures into lowering tax rates by having a broader base without sacrificing revenues so we can have a competitive tax system and more economic growth. We're going to have one more chance to grow ourselves out of this problem and show the Europeans that we're not going to copy them with little spending cuts and big tax increases and putting themselves into a lost decade. We are halfway through a lost decade right now. If you pass this substitute, pass the kinds of things that these gentlemen are talking about, we will complete a lost decade, and unfortunately that lost decade will turn into a lost generation because we are literally on the cusp of making that kind of determination. With that, I yield, I think, Mr. Mulvaney, 2 minutes. How much time would the gentleman like?
2 is fine. I was hoping that the gentleman from Maryland would enter into a brief colloquy if he would.
Gentleman gets 2 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. And I thank the gentleman from Maryland for offering the amendment. I much prefer, and I think you know this, I'd much prefer to have a discussion on the details rather than rhetoric, which seems to be what we do a lot of in this committee and another committee. So to that extent, I thank you for at least offering. And I think we did the same thing with our budget. We offered specific ideas as to how to get rid of the sequester. So I'm glad we're having a debate, or at least a discussion on details. A question that I get, Mr. Van Hollen, I got it last night on a town hall meeting, I get it from folks back home, I hear it on the media all the time, the President has a plan, the President has a plan, the President has a plan for the long-term budget, the President has a plan to get rid of the sequester, at least to replace the sequester. So my question to you is very simple. Is this the President's plan?
This amendment has two parts to it. The first part calls for a balanced approach to 10-year deficit reduction. And the answer is that the President's plan is perfectly consistent with that part of the amendment. The one-year portion of this amendment fleshes out some of the specific proposals that the President has made and are included in his budget, including eliminating about $30 billion plus in direct farm subsidies, including the Buffett rule, and including eliminating taxpayer subsidies to the big five oil companies. So the answer is that both the general 10-year provision as well as the specific one-year provision are consistent with the President's proposal.
Has the President put together that plan in one document that we can look at and say this is the President's plan for purposes of continuing this type of debate?
Sure. I mean, the President has submitted his budget, which, as I say, includes all these elements within the 10-year framework.
And lastly, just to clarify, the lady from Pennsylvania mentioned that this will reduce long-term deficits, and I think we were handed the CBO report while she's talking, and it looks like it does, over the 10-year window, reduce it by $29 billion, most of which comes from tax increases. But it's true, isn't it, Mr. Van Hollen, this actually increases the deficit during the 2013 and the 5-year window, 2013-2017, by approximately $37 billion.
Yeah, let me explain why. It's because the way the sequester cuts operate is they're very deep in the first years as well as the last years. And so what this does is weight more of the deficit reduction in a little bit more in the out years so as not to disrupt the very fragile recovery.
Right, but the net impact is that this has the same impact on the deficit as the Budget Control Act?
This will reduce the deficit. This will reduce the deficit it replaces the sequester, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are you back?
Mr. Van Hollen.
Yes, I want to, in a minute, just turn it to my colleagues, but I want to respond just very briefly to a couple of comments the Chairman made. First, with respect to the reconciliation process. As members of this committee may not know, actually, the House Republican Rules Committee refused to make an order the Democratic substitute, which essentially is the substitute that's before this committee today, which would avoid the sequester for 1 year. No opportunity to vote on that amendment in the context of an alternative to the reconciliation process. I think members need to understand that. It's also important to understand that with the House reconciliation bill, when it came to the floor, I've got the rule right here, they waived 3 provisions of House rules. So if you're going to waive 3 provisions of House rules to consider the Republican reconciliation 1-year replacement, there's no reason we can't have, as the gentleman just said, a full debate and vote on the floor of the House on a Democratic alternative. The reason it was not allowed was because we take a balanced approach to this issue, just as every bipartisan group has done. And just very briefly on the policy. Let's first dispense with one issue on taxes. We are prepared, Mr. Chairman, today to take a vote in this House on extending middle-class tax cuts. In fact, we've made it very clear that we would keep in place tax relief for people under $1 million per year and extend the Clinton-era rates on folks higher, number one. So 99% of the American people would get a guaranteed tax relief. The only reason we can't do that now is because our Republican colleagues are holding tax relief for 99% of the American people hostage to getting tax breaks for the folks at the very top. Number two, this particular amendment, we should focus on the amendment that's before us, does not increase any marginal tax rates. What it does is 2 things. Number one, it eliminates the oil and gas subsidies for the big 5, okay? I think everyone's probably familiar with President Bush's statement that when the price of oil is over $50 a barrel, you certainly don't need taxpayer subsidies to encourage investment and development of oil resources, especially the big 5. And so this deals with that issue. And it is our belief, and I agree with Senator McCain in this regard, that we shouldn't have to wait before we eliminate an unproductive taxpayer subsidy, when we can contribute that toward deficit reduction, including removing the sequester on defense and non-defense. The other component is the Buffett rule, which does not increase marginal tax rates. What it does say is that for people who are making over $1 million a year, that they pay at least a 30% tax rate, and we don't have the situation that Warren Buffett has pointed out to the country, where the people who work for him pay higher effective tax rates than Warren Buffett. So we believe that if you take those two factors along with the cuts to the direct payments and the ag subsidies, that is a good policy substitute for 1 year across-the-board cuts to defense and non-defense. So we believe it is good policy. And with that, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer. 4 minutes to the gentleman from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Van Hollen. And I do appreciate the opportunity for us to engage in clarification and discussion. And I do appreciate your clarifying a response to the chairman's point about somehow this being out of order. Our friends in the Republican caucus, when they established their rules, did some things that are relatively unprecedented in terms of being able to actually conduct our business. Rules that they have no qualms about waiving when they want to, and that's the majority's prerogative. But there's no reason that we couldn't move forward and have a balanced proposal, and it's a simple decision on the Rules Committee to enable it. And that's actually regular order for most of Republican and Democratic control for over 200 years in Congress. I do take exception to the notion that somehow we can't be involved with a substantive decision around the corner, around the committee. For example, you reference in the Farm Bill, we'll deal with things like direct payments and other areas because that's in the jurisdiction of the Farm Bill. Well, with all due respect, and we've already had this discussion here, it didn't stop the committee from delving into things under the jurisdiction of the Farm Bill, which nutrition is, every bit as much as direct payments. And you, in your wisdom, decided that you would be willing to make some rather, what most of us and most of our constituents think are pretty draconian and unnecessary.
Will you gentlemen yield on that?
I would be happy to
yield. We didn't.
Could I just...
Go ahead.
Okay, no, go ahead. No.
But no, we didn't write that policy in this committee. As you know, reconciliation is simply a function of we package bills produced by other committees and then pass them through here. So we did not write those agricultural title reforms. That was done by the Agricultural Committee, and we were simply the committee that aggregates all those bills from those, 7 different authorizing committees and then passes them through the Budget Committee to the House floor. So we did not change farm programs or nutrition programs. The Agriculture Committee did those changes.
The Agricultural Committee, which could have dealt with broader areas, and I would hope that we here on this committee would be willing to deal with areas that we really think would make a difference. And we, under the rules of the House, can do this in our deliberations here. I think that there are broad areas of agreement on both sides of the aisle on this committee that there's more we can do with defense spending. Not the blunt instrument of the sequestration, but give some guidance and direction about what is possible. Because I think there is a great deal that is possible, and I think with a little interaction on the committee, we might find that there's more agreement than one would suspect. I deeply appreciate the reference to an arcane area of flood insurance reform. I spent, nobody on the committee knows probably, for 10 years with our former colleague Doug Bereiter on trying to get a handle on reforming the flood insurance program so it wasn't sort of an open-ended entitlement replacing carpet on areas that God probably didn't want people to be living in the first place, and the taxpayer on the hook, and not just the taxpayer, but people who paid flood insurance premiums, which are the majority who paid more for a system that was inadequate, and we weren't engaged in some sort of reform that would shut down long-term obligations. And then we had the little occasion with Katrina, which brought in broad relief the long-term consequences for not getting that right. And we've got and it blew a hole in the flood insurance program, which we're slowly struggling trying to get back on. Now, this is an area that doesn't have to be partisan. It actually is very, one could argue, fiscally conservative and responsible to make some steps to make that a better program, make it more fiscally sustainable over time, and that we could move forward. I think there's sort of an interesting comparison between 8 years of a Clinton administration and 8 years of a Bush administration, testing your theories about the way to get robust job growth and constrained spending. Because, you know, actually the Obama administration increase in spending on government operations is less than Clinton, is less than what we had with the Bush administration. But those two 8-year terms stand in pretty stark contrast, where we cut taxes, didn't have near the job performance, and with all due respect, part of us were concerned that the Recovery Act, being 40% tax reduction and alternative minimum tax return, missed an opportunity to put millions of people to work on things like the gap for reauthorization of the Transportation Act. We wouldn't be in this squirrel cage trying to figure out resources for an inadequate bill maybe for 2 years if we had invested it in rebuilding and renewing the country. I hope that as a budget committee we can use the flexibility that is accorded to us to think a little differently about a path forward, to give some guidance to some of our friends in authorizing committees, to work with the Rules Committee to promote a more flexible approach to have the big issues debated and settled on the floor, rather than having them pigeonholed, as happens with the minority party. It's legal. You can do it. But I just think it's a missed opportunity to be able to take some of the things that here could build a path forward and get us on a more sustainable basis. I think everybody here agrees that we have to do business differently over the course of the next 10 years. No quarrel. But I would hope that we are not endlessly skirmishing over ideological talking points that are geared more towards the next election, and maybe obscuring things that we could work on together. And I continue to think that there are some that we could do, and I think Mr. Van Hollen has offered up an effort that would provide some of these for a spirited debate, and there are others that I think we could agree upon together. Thank you for your courtesy, and I yield back.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Garrett.
I'm swinging over here. Now we got 2 mics. Hey, now you can hear me twice as well?
Sing a song.
Do you really want me to?
No.
No, okay. So, first of all, let me say I commend the other side. I think Ms. Schwartz was starting it off by saying we need to work together on this and whether we can find some common ground. And, you know, I can see at a 30,000-foot level some common ground, specifically on the farm direct payments, absolutely right there. Secondly, on the flood provision, some of us, too, have worked on that for a long period of time, and hopefully we can work on it as well as it comes through now, because I think we're just getting about to the end on the flood bill coming back from through the process. But there are problems with it, as the chairman has already said, with the procedure on it and where these issues should be dealt with. And so in that sense, it may be considered a charade to say that we're going to include it in this bill today. It may be also a charade to say that we can find some common ground on this. The gentleman from North Carolina must have just stepped out, but there he is, but he raised the question, South Carolina raised the question of whether this is and I'll be yielding to you for 10 seconds, whether this is the President's plan, and the answer was, well, it's in his budget. I'll yield to the gentleman. Can you remind the committee just how well did the President's budget do when it went through the House and the Senate?
I don't think it did very well. In fact, I think I got 0 votes.
0 votes. So if what the Minority Party is saying is, yes, this is the President's plan, and yes, this has already been here before in his budget. Well, we've seen how far the Senate and the House thinks of that plan. So to put it up again, to only have it fail again, I think is also a charade. Now, the name of the bill is a balanced approach to a deficit reduction. The question that we should all be asking is, whose backs is this being balanced upon? I would say it is being balanced on the backs of hardworking, tax-paying Americans, the job creators of this country. I would say it's also being balanced on a very fragile economy if what we're talking about right now is raising taxes. Because who among us out there really thinks that the best way to produce more jobs, get the economy going again, is to take and extract more money from the private sector, which is what this so-called balanced approach is doing. And thirdly, on the idea of a balanced approach, I think the numbers really tell it all, whether it's balanced or not. It's $85 billion in tax increases and only $55 billion in expenditure reductions. That, to me, I don't think I could explain back to my constituents at home, is a balanced approach. Finally, we've seen the President of the United States go around a lot during his campaign tour in the last few months, and on the front of his podium, his motto or his mantra right now is forward. I think any idea of extracting more money from our taxpayers is not a forward proposal. I think this exemplifies a backward approach to fixing the economy. And with that, I yield back.
Dr. Price is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to also join my colleagues who have commended our friends on the other side for offering a proposal. It's an interesting proposal, and it's pretty simple. It's essentially like all of the other proposals that we hear from the other side, more of the same. It is increasing taxes and increasing spending. When I'm home in my district and also across the country, and I talk to folks about what ought to be done from the size of government spending and government and the like, nobody says, boy, I sure wish we could increase taxes so we could increase spending in Washington. Not a soul. So I want to commend my colleagues on the other side of the aisle for their consistency, but I don't believe and we don't believe that increasing spending and increasing taxes is the solution to grow our economy. We believe in decreasing taxes so that hardworking American taxpayers can keep more of their money so that we move the economy in the direction that that citizens believe it ought to move, not the direction the government believes it ought to move. We also believe that decreasing spending, getting our government to the size, at least, that it has been on average over the last 60 years as a percent of gross domestic product, is a responsible thing to do. And again, when I talk to folks back home, that's what they believe as well. Why on earth do we have the largest government that we've had as a percentage of GDP since World War II? It doesn't make any sense to them. Secondly, again, our friends on the other side have a penchant for picking winners and losers. They like Washington to make the rules so that they can pick their favorites to win or to lose in this economy. Oftentimes it doesn't work because there are all sorts of unintended consequences when you do that. But here we are again. They must have new polling information or repeated polling information that big oil is still bad out there. American oil companies produce American energy. When I go home, when I go across this country, I hear folks say, can't we please get more American energy production? Please? But our friends on the other side, they want to beat up on big oil. I guess it makes for good campaign commercials as we move on into this campaign season. It may be appropriate to end the kind of tax expenditures that our friends talk about for all businesses. It may be an appropriate federal policy to do that. But the last thing that we ought to be doing here in Washington is perpetuating this notion that Washington knows best and that when we pick winners and losers, it works, it helps the economy. It certainly doesn't. Third, this Buffett rule is fascinating because it is so disingenuous for our friends on the other side to say that Warren Buffett pays a lower tax rate on earned income, that's not the phrase that you ever hear, on earned income than his secretary. Because it simply isn't so, and they know it. It's just demagoguery. They know that we have a remarkably progressive tax code for earned income. Now, again, it may be appropriate to tax dividends and capital gains income at a different rate than we currently do. I believe it ought to be a whole lot lower. In fact, I believe it ought to be decreased so that we can reinvigorate this economy and incentivize individuals to plow money back into growing jobs. But it may be appropriate to decrease that for everybody. But when, again, our friends pick winners and losers and don't tell the whole story about the Buffett rule, then it changes the debate in a way that is not honest or sincere. Finally, what does this bill do that we are offering today? This 3-page piece of legislation. All it's simply doing is saying to the President, where's your plan? What's your plan? Not later than 30 days after the date of enactment of this act, the President shall submit to Congress a detailed report on the sequestration required. That's it, Mr. President. That's all we're asking. I know that the President gets out there on the campaign trail and talks about his plan, says how wonderful it is, says how he doesn't want this sequestration. Our friends on the other side say they don't want the sequestration. But where's the plan? Let's put it in writing. Let's compare the benefits to this economy, the growth in this economy from the proposal that we have offered with the proposal that the President offers, and then let's come together for the country and move forward. But we can't do that if the President doesn't produce a plan. So I want to commend our chairman for working on this issue and calling the President's bluff and saying, okay, where's your plan? And I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick response. What this asks for is the impact of the sequester. And while we're happy to get more detail on the impact of the sequester, we think we should be focused on replacing the sequester with a balanced approach. I keep hearing this charade about the President's budget not getting any votes. The White House made clear that the House Democratic alternative budget was much closer to the President's plan than the one that was voted on as a charade, number one. Number two, we keep hearing about the fact that this is too much revenue in terms of the ratio with cuts. We just did $1 trillion in cuts only. We just did $1 trillion, 100% cuts. So this is an attempt to provide some balance. In fact, if you include this, it's still 90% cuts if you take into account what we've already done. Third, with respect to the tax provisions, I would just say to my colleague, I wish you would read this provision with respect to the big oil and gas companies. It specifically references the elimination of the subsidy for foreign oil production, a loophole that U.S. Big oil companies use to actually benefit them from drilling overseas rather than here in the United States. And finally, with respect to the Buffett rule, I would just point out that under President Reagan's tax reform, he had the same tax rate applied to earned income and unearned income. No one's trying to pull a fast one. We're talking about the effective rate that Buffett makes on his income. That's what the Buffett rule is all about. So I now yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Yarmouth.
I thank my colleague. I think we have done the American people a great disservice in the way we've discussed a lot of these issues. And we've done it in two ways. One, I think both sides have been complicit in, and one, I think my colleagues on the other side have been largely responsible for. The first is to suggest that our short-term economic challenges and our long-term economic challenges can be addressed by the same set of policies. I don't know anyone who actually thinks that's true, and yet we've conflated them throughout the last few years with Simpson Bowles and in many other discussions. And the short-term challenges are where sequester, to me, is very relevant. The second mistake, and I think the chairman's done this and my colleagues on the other side consistently do this, is to try to create the impression that somehow the public sector and the private economy are different things. I make this speech all the time in my district. UPS would not be the same company if it weren't for government spending. They have a $1 billion government contract, and all the infrastructure that they use was built by the government. Norton Healthcare, a big hospital company in my district, would not be the same company without Medicare and Medicaid. The University of Louisville would not be the same institution without tens of millions of dollars in federal research grants, without Stanford loans and Pell Grants. And Humana would not be the same company it is because 80% of its volume, $2.7 billion out of $3.2 billion, is administering government programs. Those are my 4 largest employers. So to somehow hold that government spending doesn't have anything to do with the private economy is actually just doesn't make economic sense. It's not reality. We had a controversy recently in my state. A small company in Mount Olive, Kentucky, not in my district, makes jackets for the Air Force. The Air Force proposed to take the contract away from that company and give it to the federal prison system. My senators, Senator McConnell, Senator Paul, intervened. They had the Air Force reverse the decision, and the company maintained their 150 employees. Then they trumpeted this as a victory for the private sector. Sure, it's great, they're private sector jobs, but in fact, they wouldn't exist if it weren't for government spending. So when we talk about cuts of the magnitude that would occur under sequester or for any alternative to sequester, we're talking about a real impact, not just on bureaucrats in Washington, which is what the impression I think a lot of people have, but on very significant numbers of private sector employees throughout the country. So I wish we would talk about this as it really relates to the real world. We haven't been able to do that. And just one additional thought, because we talked about how the government spending is such a huge percentage of GDP, I would remind my colleagues that federal tax revenues as a percentage of the economy, as a percentage of total national income, are also at their lowest levels since the end of World War II. So I think what the ranking member has proposed in his amendment is a sound, balanced approach to dealing with the reality of the economy and not with the ideology that many of us would like to see as reality. And with that, I urge my support, or I urge my colleagues to support the substitute and yield back.
Mr. Stutzman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I too want to thank the ranking member and the minority side of the committee for bringing forward an amendment, which I think is something worthy of discussion. I've enjoyed the discussion so far today, and believe that we are here to find solutions and find places of common ground. And I think there are components to this amendment that would be common ground. And my question would be is could we, as a committee, could we as a body work together on the components in an amendment like this that we agree upon? I think you'd find a lot of support on this side of the aisle for eliminating the agricultural subsidies, the direct payments. I think you would find support within the flood insurance reform. I think you'd find support within the elimination of oil and gas subsidies. But I think when it comes to raising taxes, that's where a bill like this doesn't pass the smell test with Americans. Americans do not believe that Washington is serious about getting its house in order with the money that they already have. And so, I don't know if that's something that is of any interest to the Democrat side, but if we could show the American people that we do have places of agreement and start with the little things where we do agree, instead of splintering when it comes to raising taxes, I think that we could get something done here. This is I know it's genuine and sincere, but I think that because of tax increases, because of the desire for a balanced approach, which would bring me to another question. If you look at the revenues and the outlays over the next 10 years, it's not balanced technically because it still spends over roughly $6 billion more than what we take in. And so I think that if we want to talk about a balanced approach, we need to talk about where we're at now. We spend more money than what we have. And to start reducing spending would be that effort to get to a balanced approach of a balanced budget and being responsible with the funds that we already have. So I appreciate the offer and definitely would be open to further discussions about the certain components of this amendment, but until we get our own fiscal house in order, I don't think a tax increase will pass on, definitely not with me, and I don't think it will pass with the American people. I think they want to see, they have worked hard, they've had to make difficult choices and make cuts within their own personal budgets, within their business budgets, all without revenues increasing for them. And so just because the government has the ability to tax more and take more money out of the economy doesn't mean that we shouldn't live by the same standards. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Langford.
In a very strange way, the sequestration has done exactly what we hoped it would do. It's forced Congress to actually talk about our deficits. Now, this has not been pleasant in the process, and it's been difficult along the journey. We have had to stop every day in some committee, somewhere on this Hill, someone's talking about what do we do about our deficits. I think that's the right thing for us to deal with. I think the conversation that we can have is the right way to do it. The difficulty is the philosophical divide that's within it. There is a perception that we can either just tax more and we can get it. We have a perspective that we're spending too much. In 2009, we had a single-year anomaly that we were going to have a $1 trillion plus deficit for a single year because the economy was so bad, but it would be completely an anomaly, and then be able to bring things down and get it back under control. The problem is the economy didn't bounce back that year. The problem is the spending has not come back down, that the baseline was changed, and we went from a $1.5 trillion deficit to a huge drop of $1.4 trillion deficit the next year. If we go back to 2007, 2008, when our high deficits were $452 billion instead of $1.5 trillion or $1.4 trillion, we see a different baseline of spending. Now, the challenge of this and what we're trying to address today is the real issue of how can we get all parties together to solve this? As a House, we have already established a plan to say, here's how we solve the sequestration. We'd like to get the administration and the Senate to also come to the table and to say none of us want the sequestration, but all of us need to talk about deficits and to be able to resolve this. So our focus today is to try to get all parties at the table with a plan so we can work this out and get this resolved. Because the last thing that we need is to get to December and to try to throw something randomly together at the last second and to have a moment of panic. This is a moment in the national economy. We should be slow and deliberative, but we have to deal with this. So I would disagree with this particular resolution, this particular amendment, because the House has already established a plan. Our issue is not a lack of plan from the House. Our issue is a lack of plan from the President and a lack of plan from the Senate. That's what we've got to get, and sooner it's much better than later. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I now yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pascrell.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, since January of 2007 until now, the Congress has cut taxes over 20 times and has not increased taxes. We've debated whether certain taxes should expire. Well, if there's any doubt in your mind, I'll stand for a moment and yield 30 seconds to those. Anybody who can tell me what taxes we voted on and were increased? I yield.
There were 15 of them in the health care bill.
Yes.
There were the tanning tax, there was the tax on Cadillac plans, there was the tax on the sale of your primary residence.
Medical device.
The medical device tax we've taken up. We've actually put the list up on the board, 15.
Yeah, most of the, if I may,
Sure.
Most of those have not gone into effect at all yet, and it would seem to me that we are talking basically about income taxes. We're basically talking about business taxes, and all of those business taxes have been cut many, many times. Secondly, since 2007, when the majority did change, the Congress not only has cut these taxes, but moved in a very different direction in the previous 6 years, when you paid for nothing. 2 tax cuts in 2001, 2003, 2 wars that we'll be paying for, and our children will be paying for, and our grandchildren will be paying for, and of course the Plan D prescription drug plan, which has turned out to be a disaster, and we had to fix. We don't include those increases that we had to fix. So I think that our side would try to provide a balanced way that asks everyone to chip in, so we get our fiscal house in order. I think we both agree that our fiscal house needs to be in order, and it's not in order. But you take a very different approach, your side, and then that's not fair to those, some of you who have gotten off script. You have taken a different approach. The chairman is on Ways and Means Committee. Some of us are on this committee. And the Ways and Means Committee decided to replace the sequester with $53 billion in cuts to health care tax credits, child tax credits, and social services block grants. This is a path chosen by the Republican Party. The state of New Jersey could lose $50 million for just Meals on Wheels, foster care, and help for our senior citizens. The very next day, the majority voted to add $47 billion to the deficit. You voted to do this with an unpaid-for tax cut that will benefit professional sports teams and hedge fund managers. Does that not count? Or do you have amnesia about that? You passed it the very day after the Ways and Means Committee majority voted to cut money to health care tax credits, child tax credits, and social service block grants. So we made drastic cuts to programs that benefit the poor in the name of deficit reduction. You don't want to hear about it. You don't want to be reminded about it for a very obvious reason. I don't think in your hearts you believe in this. I really believe that. And you added $47 billion to the deficit in tax cuts. Where in God's name are your priorities? It's part of a disturbing pattern. Mr. Ryan's tax plan passed out to this committee, which reduced revenue by almost $4.5 trillion. Now, we all want to associate ourselves with that kind of stuff, of course not looking into what the consequences might be. If done in a way that is revenue neutral, the Joint Economic Committee found that this would give an average tax cut of $300,000 to families earning over $1 million a year, yet increase taxes $2,700 on families making $200,000 a year. You're interested in the middle class? There's a great history of bipartisan deficit reduction that both cuts wasteful spending and increases revenue. We know what happened in those European countries, Mr. Chairman, when they dealt simply with the subject matter at hand with austerity. A few leaders were changed on the way. And now that debate continues. And there'll be some decisions made in the next few days. So I say that this is good legislation. Someone like Jeb Bush stands up and invokes Ronald Reagan as a model of finding common ground, and they're jeered by the extreme right. That's where we're at. That's where we're at. There was a past time when we had extremists running the Democratic Party, and you've allowed yourself to surrender the middle class. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Only in Washington is the refusal to raise taxes $4.4 trillion considered a tax cut. With that, Mr. Ribble.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do want to thank the ranking member for offering the amendment. I think there are some places here where, as Mr. Blumenauer said, there's some agreement here. And often in this town, and I've only been here about 18 months, so often in this town we have a tendency to focus on all the things we disagree and not hardly enough time focusing on things we agree. My problem with Mr. Van Hollen's amendment today is really, I'm just going to avoid the whole policy thing, is that it just isn't even germane to what we're here for today for. And for me to get a 66-page amendment that deals with jurisdictions well outside this committee that have had absolutely no time to study or compare, it's hard for me to support at any level when I might in fact have things in there I might support. And that's the problem. Whereas the 3-page amendment that the chairman has offered, pretty straightforward. It's simply asking the president to give us a report on how he would handle it. All this other discussion that we've had might make for great YouTube clips for websites, but doesn't really move anything forward. This process for the minority party to offer these amendments through the proper committee channels and get them debated officially and hold hearings and move forward with the process, if it makes sense. And I would suggest that that's where this stuff goes. And with that, I'd encourage my colleagues to vote no on the amendment by Mr. Van Hollen. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
We'll go Mr. Flores, then Mr. Mulvaney. Flores, then Mulvaney.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I think there are a few facts we need to look at. Everybody talks about the Buffett rule, talking about trying to get the rich to pay more taxes. Under the tax rates that we have today, the top 1% pay a higher percentage of the overall tax load of U.S. taxes than they did under the Clinton tax rates. They pay 37% of the total tax load today versus 34% under Clinton. Then we can use some real-world examples like California and Illinois, both high-tax states that have recently continued to go attack the goose that laid the golden egg. You have jobs fleeing from those two states because of their oppressive tax code. Why is it any different with the United States? Why is it that we think we're going to have more job growth when we raise taxes on those people? Those top 5 oil companies, what if they just moved their headquarters out of the United States and moved overseas? Does that make us better off? Is that the approach that we're trying to take? So let's focus on the facts. Lower tax rates encourage more income growth across all tax income levels. There are areas of agreement that we have. One, I agree we need to reform flood insurance. I think we need to reform congressional retirement. I think we need to reform ag subsidies. I think we need to look at the tax expenditures and overly complex tax code. And we've stacked it up here on the desk before. But we need to go a lot further. We need to grow revenues, if you want to talk about a balanced approach, but let's grow revenues because we're growing the national income. Let's get it where everybody pays more because everybody's working and everybody's making more money and everybody has more after-tax take-home dollars on their paycheck. We do that by growing the private sector. Let's eliminate subsidies and tax breaks so we simplify the tax code, so we take the government out of picking which industries get different tax breaks versus other industries. Let's go farther. Let's eliminate the congressional retirement plan altogether. That's a novel idea. Why don't we lower congressional pay like the private sector does when we're running huge deficits? Why don't we turn congressional pay to zero when the Senate doesn't pass a budget for 3 years? Why don't we vote on things that really improve jobs, that create jobs, more keystones and fewer cylinders? And why don't we have policies that replace food stamps with paychecks and have more Americans working and more American job creation? This, unfortunately, Mr. Van Hollen's amendment does none of those things except for the first few that I announced on flood insurance, congressional retirement, and ag subsidies. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I always enjoy the exchanges with my friend from New Jersey, and one of the things he pointed out caught my attention, which was the vote on the giving the tax breaks, the small business tax credits to professional sports teams, and that caught my attention because I voted against it for many of the reasons that you've just mentioned. And I also like to think that every now and then some consistency is admirable. I've heard a lot of nice things today about Simpson Bowles from the proponents of this particular amendment. And I congratulate Ms. Schwartz and Mr. Schuler, who's not here, for actually voting for that on the floor when it came up during the budget debate. Everybody else across the aisle for me voted against it. It's great today, but it's an amendment and it's offered as a balanced approach. But every single one of you, with the exception of Ms. Schwartz and Mr. Schuler, voted against it when a member of your party, and I guess that was our party, it was a bipartisan effort, brought it up on the floor. Y'all voted against it. Mr. Pascrell, when the extension of the Bush, and now what I call the Bush-Obama tax cuts came up during the lame duck session in 2010, you voted for that. You voted for these awful tax decreases on the rich, which you decry so aggressively today. But when you had a chance to vote against it, you didn't. You voted for it. And then now the Bush-Obama tax cuts. Why do I mention this? I mention this, I will when I'm finished. I'd be happy to. Again, I'm not trying to dominate the discussion. Why do I mention this? Y'all had the chance to do this. You ran the country for 2 years. You could have gone back to the Clinton tax rates if you really wanted to. You could have gotten rid of every single incentive for big oil that you wanted to. You could have put every Buffett rule you wanted to in place. You could have done anything you wanted for 2 years. And you didn't. What did you do? You did health care. What that tells me is that either you don't believe what you're doing today and you're just trying to make political points, or you really do believe that health care is more important than all of these things. And either way, I just happen to disagree with you. You ran the place for 2 years with carte blanche. We could do nothing to stop you. We could do nothing to stop you. And you didn't do any of the things that you talk so vehemently about today that the nation needs. Where was the discussion 2 years ago about deficits and debts? Where was the discussion 2 years ago about a balanced approach? Was health care a balanced approach? I mean, and I recognize the fact that y'all do it to us because we do it to you, and I am completely sympathetic, Mr. Van Hollen, to the concerns about the fact that we waive rules. I think it's wrong. I absolutely think that it's wrong, and every time I talk to my folks about it, I say, well, they did it to us 2 years ago, and they say, well, we did it to you, and you did it to us, and that's where we are. And it's wrong for us to do that. I think it undermines our credibility when either party, when they're a majority, doesn't abide by the rules. But the point of the matter is, y'all had the chance to do this 2 years ago and didn't, and I think it's a shame that we have to end up spending half a day today talking about something that evidently y'all don't believe in very much. With that, I'll yield back.
So why don't we'll reserve ours, you go down to your 5 or whatever, and then we'll exhaust the rest of ours.
Yep.
Okay. Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just first a point of clarification, Mr. Mulvaney. I'd be happy to share with you a piece we wrote showing that the provision that was offered on the floor in the name of Simpson Bowles was not Simpson Bowles. Names can be misleading, and I hope the gentleman will take a look at it because I support the framework of Simpson Bowles. It just wasn't the case. So I do take some I just would dispute your comments. Let me now give 3 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Ryan.
I thank the gentleman. I'd also like to say when Mr. Schuler offered that amendment in this committee, I voted for it. And it was, I think, Mr. Schuler and I in the committee for the framework that was actually the framework of Simpson Bowles. Couple points here. We did health care because we were trying to address the issue of the deficit, and the Congressional Budget Office agreed with us and said over the first decade we'd save over $100 billion, and over the second decade we'd save over $1 trillion in bringing down health care costs, which would reduce the deficit and would also help those small business people where health care went up 120% over the last decade. I'll give you 10 seconds just because we're going to be on the baseball field tomorrow night against each other. Go ahead, I'll give you 10 seconds.
In light of the fact that the CBO has doubled the cost of the program now, has taken it from $900 billion to $1.8 trillion. That's come out in the last 6 months. Does that change your opinion of the bill?
Well, the bottom line is this brings down health care costs over the long term. And I have health care systems in my district now that are implementing the accountable care organizations, the medical homes, and the other things that are in the bill, and they're saving money as we speak right now. The gentleman, Mr. Flory, said the top 1% is paying 37% of taxes. It's because the middle class wages have been stagnant, the economy's collapsed. Of course, the top 1%, they're the only ones making any money right now. So of course they're going to pay a larger percentage of what's coming in for income. And, you know, I would love to agree with you guys, but I just can't say this any clearer. Your economic philosophy is wrong. It doesn't work. And you mentioned a couple of states. A study just came out, the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, from 2001 to 2010, comparing no-tax states against the highest tax states. Check this out. Per capita economic output was overall 50 states was 8.1%. For the 9 no-tax states, it was higher than that. It was 8.7%. But the 9 highest tax states actually grew at 10.1%. You take median household income, the no tax states fell by 3.5%. The high tax states only fell by 0.7%. For every complex solution, or for every complex problem, there is a solution that is clear, simple, and wrong. And I believe that this supply-side economics theory that you fellas and folks have been peddling now just doesn't work. And I agree with what Mr. Pasquarello was saying. I voted to keep the Bush tax cuts going too, because you can't raise taxes when we're this down in the economy. You got to keep taxes low, and that's why the president and we cut taxes so many times. This austerity program is going to be a disaster for our country. We see what's happening in Europe right now. You can't take your foot off the gas pedal right now. And people say, oh, you're going to go borrow money. And I may be a bit off script here. Yes, you're going to borrow money. You're going to borrow money at 1%, and you're going to pump it into infrastructure, and you're going to put people back to work and do what everyone here wants, and that's get them back to work so they're paying taxes and more money goes into the revenue. Let's not pretend that borrowing $100 billion or $200 billion or whatever the number is going to have any impact over the long-term deficits of this country. It just won't, especially when you're borrowing it at 1%. It's entitlements. We all know where the money is. And so I can sit here and say I voted for the Simpson-Bowles framework. Deficits long-term, we're all in agreement. But strapping spending in the short term is bad economics. And the theory that the low-tax states are doing better just isn't working. Look at the numbers. It's just not working. The higher tax states actually grew more because it's about infrastructure, it's about education, it's about research, it's about investments. It's not as simple as just the tax rates. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to hear the discussion today about finding common ground, and I really thank all of my colleagues for that. I want to support Mr. Yarmouth's comment about the impact of government spending on the private sector, and I'm sure that we all have similar examples in our district that we should consider. I'm a little concerned about the characterization of the ranking member's proposal as one that picks winners and losers. So on the contrary, that was done when the policies were passed that allow the subsidies, direct payments, and tax breaks. And the ranking member's proposal actually corrects that. I also want to reiterate what Mr. Ryan from Ohio was saying about the impact of tax policies. Businesses looking to locate, they want to know that a community has a strong transportation infrastructure, that they have strong schools, that they have programs for those who are struggling. That all matters. It isn't just the tax rates that draw business. My final comment is, I haven't been here very long, but I know that our purpose here is to make good policy. And although we obviously disagree about how we're going to do that, that's why we're here. People across our districts are very concerned about the impact of sequestration. I just had a discussion with some people about it this morning. That's why we're here. That's what we should be discussing. So I find it truly unfortunate that the other side has characterized the chairman's bill as calling the president's bluff. We're really here to discuss a serious issue of sequestration, and I hope you agree that that is our purpose here, to find the best way to avoid that that's good for all of our districts and our constituents. And I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Van Hollen.
Mr. Hilleskamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple points. I appreciate the debate and discussion here. Two things that I'd like to mention. One is the reference, or the chairman outlined that the tax increases proposed in this amendment would be on top of the massive tax increase on January 1st. Is that correct? That's my understanding. And one thing I want to note here that at least on early June, I thought I had some agreement with one of the favored politicians the other side, President Bill Clinton. On June 5th, he said he was against the tax hikes on January 1st. And there was some suggestion that maybe he was on the other side of that on the next day. But the point is, the Bush-Obama tax cuts, if they are allowed to expire, I will agree with Mr. Ryan that I really don't think the economy has collapsed yet, as you've indicated, but a $4 trillion tax hike on January 1st, I think, will be that final impact on the economy where we could have the type of economic concern that the congressman has. But in addition to the former president, numerous U.S. senators are against the tax hike, at least from what I can tell what they've said. And as we sit here today and talk about putting these tax increases on top of those, my concern is that avoiding that massive tax increase on January 1st. So that's point number one. But point number two, more directly to the underlying bill. I mean, we had Secretary Panetta sitting in that chair. The question I asked him is, what is your plan for sequestration? How are you going to handle that? Your budget has absolutely nothing in it that would follow the law. And he said, well, the budget director told me I could ignore sequestration. Ladies and gentlemen, I mean, he was chairman of this committee. How can you ignore the law? Not only how can you ignore the law, how can you ignore the consequences on national security? I don't know what the answer is. But when the budget director and the Secretary of Defense says we're going to ignore the law and hopefully it goes away on January 2nd, we can hope, but that is the law. And this bill here is to attempt to tell the administration, please do your job, tell us how you plan on avoiding what you said is a major disaster, but you budgeted for it not at all. So I support the underlying bill. I think the amendment actually goes much further in the wrong direction as the massive tax increases on January 1st. But again, I agree also with President Obama from August 2009. He said he can't raise taxes in a recession. That was also his position in December of 2010, but come January of 2011, it was the position that let's raise taxes. But don't forget as well, the Bush-Obama tax cuts, as he said back in December of 2010, 85% of those went directly to the middle or lower income folks, and they will be hurt the most, I believe, with these tax increases. So with that, I'll yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
30 seconds or a minute to Mr. Flores.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to make sure that everybody understands the facts because Mr. Ryan threw out some interesting implications regarding states' economic performance. The unemployment for low-tax states, and I'm just going to name a few, like North Dakota is 3%, Texas is 6.9%, Kansas is 6.1%, Indiana, which has changed its tax structure, is 7.9%, Wisconsin 6.8%, all below the national average. And then we have the high-tax states that I referenced. California, 10.8%, Illinois, 8.6%. I think the facts speak for themselves. Thank you. I yield.
Gentleman yield? Will gentleman yield? Just for 10 seconds?
No, I need the time.
You need the time?
I do.
You're the chairman.
My friend,
I need the time. I'm a backbencher over here.
The gentleman from Ohio with the great name and the wrong philosophy. Said, yeah, not so bad. Said something fairly revealing a minute ago, which is back in 2010, when everybody agreed to keep the tax rates where they are and prevent the increases, we didn't want to hurt the economy because the economy was hurting. So I guess the economy is doing well now. We can start raising taxes? Is that the presumption? I mean, because the amendment here has an $85 billion tax increase in it. It has a $55 billion spending increase in it. So I guess we feel complicit or comfortable raising taxes right now on top of the $4.4 trillion tax increase, which, by the way, the director of the CBO was here a couple of weeks ago saying it will create a recession. So we have CBO telling us if this fiscal cliff comes, primarily because of the tax increases, we'll go into a recession, and the minority seems complicit with that and piling on top of it another tax increase. Look at the individual components of it. Basically effectively repealing deferral by limiting all the foreign tax credits to certain oil companies. We had a little experiment with this in the 1980s. We ended deferral for shipping companies that are U.S.-based. Now we don't have any more U.S.-based shipping companies. They had to become foreign companies in order to survive. Look, we believe we should go after tax expenditures in tax reform to lower tax rates so we can have economic growth, so we can have prosperity, so we can create jobs, which gets more revenues. And we don't want to take our eye off the ball, and that is the fact that we are borrowing 40 cents of every dollar that is spent here. We can't keep spending money we just don't have. Unfortunately, this substitute does that, but more importantly, this substitute displaces, replaces what has been a bipartisan bill which says, OMB, show us how you're going to do this. There are defense contractors with hundreds of thousands of employees who, because OMB is not giving them any direction, are about to put layoff notices to all of their employees because they have no idea how this is going to come down. So let's save them the grief, these people who work for these businesses, and have OMB give us some specificity. This is bipartisan. It was voice voted in the Senate. So let's reject this substitute, pass the underlying bill on a bipartisan basis so we can do the country the favor of having some specificity. We passed a plan. The Senate hasn't. The President hasn't done anything. So that we don't send all these layoff notices to people who may or may not get laid off because of the lack of specificity coming from OMB. Mr. Van Hollen is recognized to close on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you really want to do exactly what you said, you would pass the substitute, because then those defense contractors and all the other folks who also receive domestic discretionary spending, like NIH, would not have to make those cuts. They wouldn't have to send out those layoff notices. That's exactly what the substitute is all about. Now, let me just deal with a couple red herrings. This bill does not raise taxes $4 trillion. If you apply that logic, the Republican reconciliation bill increased taxes by $4 trillion because the Republican reconciliation bill did not include an extension of the Bush tax cuts. Listen, I said at the beginning we could resolve that tax issue today. We have said let's extend tax relief for 99% of the American people. The Republican position is no, we won't extend it for 99% of the American people unless we can also extend tax breaks for the top 1%. We believe that we need to be serious about our deficit and deal with it in a balanced way. We did $1 trillion in cuts only last summer. What this proposes is a mix of cuts and, yes, revenue, by saying to the big oil companies, the big five, you don't need those taxpayer subsidies. President Bush said the same thing. In fact, the executives of those five oil companies said the same thing in testimony just a few years ago. This says to the folks who are making more than $1 million a year, pay the same effective tax rate as the people who are working for you. It doesn't increase marginal tax rates. So let's focus on the specific proposal. And what it comes down to is this. Our Republican colleagues say they don't want to cut defense. We don't want to cut across the board on the defense or the domestic side. People like Senator McCain have it right. Chairman McKeon had it right last fall when he said that when it comes down to a choice of cutting defense spending or cutting special interest tax breaks, he would choose, Chairman McKeon and Senator McCain, choosing to cut those special interest tax breaks. Senator McCain just said it the other day. Getting rid of ethanol subsidies he doesn't see as a tax increase. You can contribute that toward deficit reduction. You can contribute that toward replacing the sequester so you don't have defense cuts. The reality is, at the end of the day, our colleagues in the House are every time when they're given the choice between cutting defense spending or cutting tax breaks, they choose to cut, they refuse to not cut the tax breaks. I mean, and that's what this substitute proposes. That's the choice that's presented here. And if we vote for this substitute, all those contractors you talked about, they won't have to worry about the sequester because we'll have replaced it with an equivalent amount, in fact, $8 billion more of deficit reduction over the 10-year period by passing this substitute. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment.
Our substitute cut it by more than $247 billion more, so we upped it.
But this replaces the sequester and, in fact, does $8 billion on top of that in deficit reduction. So,
all time for the debate has expired. The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman from Maryland. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Roll call vote is requested. The clerk shall record the roll.
Mr. Garrett. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Campbell.
No.
Mr. Campbell. No. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Aiken.
No.
Mr. Aiken. No. Mr. Cole. Mr. Price.
No.
Mr. Price. No. Mr. McClintock.
No.
Mr. McClintock. No. Mr. Chaffetz.
No.
Mr. Chaffetz. No. Mr. Stutzman? Mr. Stutzman? No. Mr. Langford?
No.
Mr. Langford? No. Ms. Black? No. Ms. Black? No. Mr. Ribble?
No.
Mr. Ribble? No. Mr. Flores?
No.
Mr. Flores? No. Mr. Mulvaney?
No.
Mr. Mulvaney? No. Mr. Hulskamp?
No.
Mr. Hulskamp? No. Mr. Young?
No.
Mr. Young? No. Mr. Amash?
No.
Mr. Amash? No. Mr. Okita?
No.
Mr. Okita? No. Mr. Ginta?
No.
Mr. Ginta? No. Mr. Woodall?
No.
Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Garrett?
No.
Mr. Garrett? No. Mr. Van Hollen? Mr. Van Hollen? Aye. Ms. Schwartz? Ms. Schwartz? Aye. Ms. Capter? Mr. Doggett? Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer? Aye. Ms. McCollum? Mr. Yarmouth? Mr. Yarmouth? Aye. Mr. Pascarell? Mr. Pascarell? Aye. Mr. Honda? Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan? Aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Aye. Ms. Moore? Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor? Aye. Mr. Schuler? Ms. Bass? Ms. Bass? Aye. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes are 10, the noes are 18.
Noes 10, ayes, noes 18, ayes 10. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. I move that the committee in the budget report the bill as amended to the House with recommendation that the bill do pass. The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, that the ayes have it. Roll call. Okay. And on that question, I ask for a roll call vote. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Garrett? Aye. Mr. Garrett? Aye. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Campbell? Aye. Mr. Campbell? Aye. Mr. Calvert? Mr. Aiken? Aye. Mr. Aiken? Aye. Mr. Cole? Mr. Price? Aye. Mr. Price? Aye. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock? Aye. Mr. Chaffetz? Aye. Mr. Chaffetz? Aye. Mr. Stutzman? Mr. Stutzman? Aye. Mr. Langford? Aye. Mr. Langford? Aye. Ms. Black? Aye. Ms. Black? Aye. Mr. Ribble? Aye. Mr. Ribble? Aye. Mr. Flores? Aye. Mr. Flores? Aye. Mr. Mulvaney? Aye. Mr. Mulvaney? Aye. Mr. Hulskamp? Aye. Mr. Hulskamp? Aye. Mr. Young? Aye. Mr. Young? Aye. Mr. Amash? Yes. Mr. Amash? Aye. Mr. Okita? Aye. Mr. Okita? Aye. Mr. Ginta? Aye. Mr. Ginta? Aye. Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Van Hollen? Aye. Mr. Van Hollen? Aye. Ms. Schwartz? Aye. Ms. Schwartz? Aye. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer? Aye. Ms. McCollum? Mr. Yarmouth? Mr. Yarmouth? Aye. Mr. Pascarell?
Yes.
Mr. Pascarell? Aye. Mr. Honda? Mr. Ryan? Aye. Mr. Ryan? Aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Aye. Ms. Moore? Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor? Aye. Mr. Schuler? Ms. Bass? Ms. Bass? Aye. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman? Aye.
I'll do it right here.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes are 29, the noes are 0.
29 ayes, 0 noes. Oh, May I report my vote on that? Clerk, reopen the roll.
Mr. Doggett?
Aye.
Mr. Doggett? Aye. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes are 30, the noes are 0.
30-0, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. The Sequestration Transparency Act of 2012 is ordered reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. I also note for the record that the quorum is present. Mr. Garrett is recognized.
And Mr. Chairman, and congratulations on a unanimous vote on that vote. And also, I move pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 22 that the committee authorize the chairman to offer such other motions as may be necessary in the House to go to the conference with the Senate on the Sequestration Transparency Act of 2012 or a similar Senate bill.
Without objection, the motion is agreed to.
And I ask also for unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make any and all necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr.
Van
Chairman,
Hollen?
I ask for the requisite number of days for minority views to be filed.
Without objection, and before I adjourn for the day, we would like to note that Gail Miller, the minority clerk, the minority counsel, is primed to retire. And a lot of us have known Gail for a long time. The budget committees have worked very well at a staff level together, even though members disagree fairly strenuously on some issues. We have had such a tremendous professional staff that has worked well together so that the budget system works. Gail is a product of both the Republican and Democratic side of the aisle. She's held herself with a distinguished career. She has commanded respect from everybody on both sides of the aisle, always. And with that, I'd like to yield to Mr. Van Hollen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I haven't had the privilege of knowing Gail Miller as long as you and some of our colleagues on this committee have, but in the relatively shorter period in which I've known Gail, she has proved absolutely indispensable, and I'm not sure what we're going to do on our side of the aisle when she's gone. As you indicated, she has the respect of her colleagues, both in the congressional branch as well as the executive branch, served in both branches of government, in a number of government agencies. I would also note that I know she's particularly proud of her achievements in raising two wonderful children, Joan and Jean, and at the same time balancing that with a very effective performance here on Capitol Hill. So Gail, we want to thank you for your service to the Budget Committee, to Congress, and most importantly to the country. Thank you.
Gail, please know that you have our respect and our gratitude for your service here in Congress. That completes the committee's business for the day. The committee stands adjourned.